Hello, this is David, and I got two hostages with me, pretending to be Orthodox Christians while being Roman Catholics. Anyways, this video, we are going to be taking a look at the Taylor Marshall stream he did with Timothy Flanders on Eastern Orthodoxy. You have the host, David, the real Mid White, and with me, I have two very smart, intelligent people with me, Snek and Lewis Reheb. Introduce yourselves. I'll force Snek to start by talking about who he is, and so that you don't just jump in and you guys start saying, "Oh, who are these people?" Right? So Snek, introduce yourself.
Hello, so I'm Snek. I'm an Orthodox catechumen, former Roman Catholic, and I've already been doing some lives with Jay. We've had a very interesting one, and also one to come soon on the same topic that we're looking at right now. And I'm also, working for the French website for Orthodox, and basically we're doing a lot of Orthodox apologetics online in French. I'm oftentimes working alongside the Precept Gang, which is David's team, and alongside Jay as well. So it's me, Snek.
All right, Lewis. What about you? What's your story?
Well, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I have been including my catechumenate for just about 4 years now, maybe just over. I'm a convert from atheism, from a militant form of atheism. And yeah, I got really interested in the apologetics scene since becoming Christian. I used to debate a lot when I was an atheist. That didn't stop after becoming Christian. So mainly interested in atheism, Roman Catholicism, and Islam.
All right, good. And you guys probably know about me, and if you don't know, well, welcome to my channel. Either way, let's just dive into the stream so we can get this over with quickly, because I'm pretty sure all of us here, Snek, Lewis, and I, we didn't want to do this. We didn't want to cover this video, and it's not because we're afraid or anything of that sort, but it's more because a lot of the stuff in the stream was pure misinformation, and I think that's really why we even did this. It's pure misinformation, and thousands of people are being deceived by Taylor Marshall and Timothy Flanders and their misrepresentation of Orthodoxy. Now, there is, of course, some sort of truth in some of their criticisms, but most of the criticisms that they have is either applies more so to themselves or is simply incorrect and is historically inaccurate. And another thing that I would like to mention is that what's really interesting is that Taylor Marshall and Timothy both, they want to make videos against Orthodoxy. They want to attack us. Okay, that's fine. You might think that Roman Catholicism is the truth, and you might want to defend that truth in your eyes. That's acceptable. What's not acceptable is pretending to fight for the truth while avoiding dialogue with other Orthodox Christians. So, for example, Jay Dyer is a great example of this. He asked both of them to debate him for months, and he's basically the top Orthodox apologetics in that sense. So he's the best person for both of them to debate. What do they both do? They just avoid him. And if they don't want to debate Jay, well, sure, why don't they debate any other Orthodox Christian? Perhaps Father John Whiteford will be one of them. Perhaps Seraphim Hamilton, or perhaps even me, right? They have a variety of people in the Orthodox world to choose from, but they won't debate, they won't have any discussion. They just want to make their videos, and at this stage, I personally think, I don't know about you guys, but I personally think at this stage they're acting in bad faith, because they just want to talk bad about Orthodoxy and not give us a chance to correct ourselves. And one of the things that I would like to start off the stream right off the bat, to me, and we can talk about this with Lewis and Snek as well, to me it seems that Tim, and I don't want to do a character attack straight off the bat, there's a lot of things that we're going to be talking about, but one of the weird things that seem to me is that there are some hints of prelest in Timothy Flanders. So one of those instances of prelest, as far as I was concerned, is he says he's humble and he's devoid, can't speak today, devoid of pride in multiple different instances. I don't know how many times. Snek, you counted them. How many times did Tim say that he's devoid of pride?
Yeah, so I think I was a bit lenient, but he mentions pride quite a lot. And in total, he said that he was devoid of pride, and that people who have different opinions than him have them out of pride a total of 28 times.
And it's important to note that his reasoning for this is that he was prideful when he was a Protestant and when he was an Orthodox. Therefore, everyone else who is must also be.
Yeah, it seems weird. It seems some kind of a projection in that sense. And I don't want to dive too much into psychology because everyone has their own story, but it seems to me that he's kind of projecting in a lot of instances. So one of the weird things he also said is that he believed that the schism happened when he was Orthodox. So he said that during the Divine Liturgy, he felt that the schism happened because of him.
He says at 13 minutes 45 approximately, he says, God told me the schism is because of me and my pride. He said, I felt God telling me that the schism was because of me and my pride.
And I remember there was another thing that he talked about in regards to pride, something about the authority of the church, like when he became Roman Catholic. Why does he believe that in the Roman Catholic system he is devoid of pride anymore?
He basically believes that the Roman pontiff is the cure to pride. That's what he says in his blog article. I can't get the quote up right now.
I think something like the living authority of the church cures my pride.
That's
right?
The one. Yeah, that's exactly what he said. And so yeah, he thinks that he was all prideful, but then the Pope, cures the pride by making him submit to the Pope.
At the 36th minute, he even gives a theological argument. He says that, and I quote, that actually he says that the papal primacy is what shakes our pride, and that basically people by default will reject the papal primacy because of the original sin. So he's making a very Calvinistic, actually, a total depravity argument. Like you can believe, you can't. People are not inclined to look at the papacy because it's a human fallen nature to reject the papacy, which is interesting because the Catholic understanding of original sin supposedly comes after the papacy itself.
Yeah, at that same timestamp, 35 minutes and 40 seconds, he says that, quote, the question of the Roman primacy is not an objective question. He says, as you said, that the original sin draws us away from the primacy and checks our pride. And he analogizes this to I think he was studying frogs or something, or doing some kind of scientific endeavor. So he seems to not believe that you can look at history objectively and determine whether the Roman primacy is true or not because you have pride, because you have original sin. But that's going to contradict what he says later, as we'll see.
And Snek mentioned theology, and that kind of made me, it kind of reminded me of a point that I missed out on. Throughout the whole stream, which lasted 90 minutes, just a little less than 90 minutes, there was not a single theological point, right? So there was not a single theological argument against the Orthodox position. It was really about the papal structure and certain other claims about Orthodox ecclesiology, Orthodox church structure. One thing that I want to talk about, this might end up kind of being long, but this is very important to talk about because what Tim does, and I don't understand why he does this, but he lumps us with the non-Chalcedonian so-called Orthodox. So he lumps us with the Assyrian Church of the East, and he lumps us with the Monophysites, right? The Oriental heterodox. And anyone that looks at my content, I do have a lot of content against Oriental heterodoxy. He lumps us together, and he even says that we kind of settle our differences, which is completely wrong. But one thing I want to note is by lumping us together, he is actually committing to a Freudian slip. And the reason why he's committing to a Freudian slip is very simple. The schism with the Non-Chalcedonians happened before 1054, before the schism with Rome. And so if it's a schism that we have and not a schism that they have, that just vindicates our position. That just means that we are the pre-schism church. So it's really strange that they're lumping us together with the Non-Chalcedonian Orthodox, because we don't share communion. We're not part of the same church. So lumping us together when he has been Orthodox for so long, supposedly, he doesn't even know something as basic as that. Now, he does cite the ecumenical dialogues that we had in the 60s and 80s and so on and so forth. But that doesn't matter, because as Joseph Farrell points out in his analysis of those ecumenical dialogues, is that both sides, they will agree on metaphysics and they will agree on compound hypostasis, which is, by the way, something the Orthodox Church preached forever, basically, ever since the Council of Chalcedon. Compound hypostasis in certain qualifications. That is, those qualifications we already talked about with J. Dyer and so on and so forth. But in regards to those dialogues, both sides accused each other of basically not understanding themselves. So what really happened in these ecumenical dialogues is that no progress was made. It was just a simple talk happened and nothing was really hashed out. So we were still at the beginning. We were basically at the beginning of the talks. And the reason I'm even talking about this is because a lot of people make this mistake that we're basically the Non-Chalcedonians. We're basically the same church. Actually, we're not really the same church. We have our differences. We're not in communion. There's a reason why we're not in communion, because we don't have the same theology. And that's the point of Eucharist, is theological and doctrinal unity. Something that is completely missed out on in the stream that Taylor Marshall did. And so I think it will be. Do you guys have anything to add, or should I just move on with some of the other mistakes that they made, some basic mistakes that they made?
Yeah, at 13 minutes, not only does he lump us in with the Non-Chalcedonians, but he also lumps us in with the Assyrian Church of the East. Mm-hmm. He basically implies that, he says, the schisms are among those Eastern churches. There's all these schisms among the Eastern churches, which would kind of, a lot of these problems we're going to see that they bring up it's really quite easy to just pick up a mirror and reflect the problem back at them. In this case, one could just be as ridiculous as this and say, well, there's all these schisms amongst the churches of the West. We've got the Protestants, we've got the Baptists, the Lutherans. I'm not saying the Protestants are separate to Lutherans, but you know what I mean. You've got all these Protestant denominations and the Roman Catholic Church, and so yeah.
Yeah, I would like to comment on the Freudian slip. And yes, whenever they see a problem in the East, they just put it on our back, saying that, for example, the Oriental Orthodox are basically all problem or branch of us, and they actually commit this kind of fallacy quite extensively, and several times they deny their own church history. For example, they also regarding pride, there's a comment. So that's at 20 minutes, where he actually says that we're just being anti-Rome, so he's characterizing us. And there's actually another comment about schism being systematically bad, and us holding grudges, apparently holding grudges. So that's at 1 hour and 17 minutes. That we do not give forgiveness, and that we're too prideful, and this is gonna weigh to us at the time of judgment. But what's interesting is that here again you see a denial of the tradition in Rome, because actually we don't hold grudges, but we remember our martyrs. And for example, when he says that we are focusing way too much on the Fourth Crusade, actually we're not holding grudge for the Fourth Crusade. We are just simply not. We are just remembering, not forgetting our martyrs. And if you read Revelation, it's clear that it is the blood of the martyrs that calls to Christ. and it's Christ that avenges them. And in comparison, we can see that Rome has no problem forgetting its own martyrs. We can see that they removed many saints from the calendar. They removed, at some point, Saint George, saying that, you just in a unit calendar would just remove him. He was added back. They removed Saint Cyril of Alexandria at some point. It was, I think, Cardinal Baronius who said that it was interesting for the papacy to remove him because at the Council of Ephesus, he kind of put some shade on the papacy. And they even removed some more recent martyr, post-schism martyr, such as Saint Simon of Trent, who was formerly beatified, who had icons made of him. And apparently the circumstances of his martyrdom were seen retrospectively as controversial, so he was removed. I'll come to other arguments, but oftentimes he really he forgets the entire church history.
And another thing I was reminded of is one statement that Taylor Marshall made about Nestorianism really stick with me, and I'm going to show the image here on the stream right now. He says that the Orthodox accept Saint Isaac and Nestorian as a saint, and he's like, just saying, you accept the Nestorian as a saint. So the first refutation of that will simply be to state that, well, he's also a saint in your church because you're in communion with the Unionists. And we were going to be talking about the Unionists because it's something that they completely ignored throughout the whole stream. They didn't even talk about the Unionists, which is natural because if they knew about Unionists, or if they talked about Unionists, people will realize, wait a second, all of the bad stuff that you're talking about, you have the same problems in your church too. But a big myth that needs to be busted is that Saint Isaac of Syria, Saint Isaac of Nineveh, same people, he was actually part of the church. Not a lot of people know this, but the Assyrian Church of the East was briefly in communion at the time of Saint Isaac the Syrian. There was a moderate party in the Assyrian Church of the East that did accept the Council of Ephesus, they accepted the Council of Chalcedon, and they were in communion with us for a brief amount of time. And Saint Isaac the Syrian, in his writings himself, rejects Nestorianism. He points out that he does not believe in Nestorianism, that he believes in one person, one hypostasis in Christ. So, no, we canonize the saint that was in our church. So, this lie or this illiteracy from Taylor Marshall is completely false. And I think that will be a good segue to our next section, which is basically talking about some of the mistakes, the claims that they made against our church, some of the basic claims they made against our church that are completely wrong. And one other thing that I would like to mention, then give the floor to others, is he talks about the Moscow Patriarchate and the Ecumenical Patriarchate being in some sort of a rivalry with one another. And he talks as if that's something that's not natural in a church, that never happens in a church. But one example I will give you is the rivalry between the Antiochian Patriarchate and the Alexandrian Patriarchate in the 5th century. So this is after the Council of Ephesus, where Antioch and Alexandria was in schism for 2 years. Now that begs the question, right? They're talking about how the papal structure keeps them away from schism, keeps them away from heresy, and so on and so forth. How did that schism even occur in that case? How did the schism even occur? One of the other problems that I saw is that Timothy doesn't even know about the problems in the Orthodox Church. He wasn't even sure if Antioch was in communion with EP and the Moscow Patriarchate. He had no idea what he was talking about. And
at 1852, he says, quote, "I haven't followed it, but I've heard XYZ."
Oh, so he hasn't followed it, and he doesn't know much about it, but he's an authority to talk about the problems that we have in our church. So how the guy that Taylor is inviting in the stream doesn't even know what he's talking about. He doesn't even know about the topic he's talking about. And Antioch is indeed in communion with both Moscow and in Constantinople. And Taylor said
these kinds of things are common in church history. Very
exactly.
Common.
And what does Taylor do?
Themselves.
What does Taylor do? He says, "Oh, that sounds so stupid." Well, Taylor, according to that logic, your church history is stupid because, just as I mentioned before, Antioch and Alexandria were in schism for 2 years. They were not in communion with one another for 2 years until the formula of reunion after the Council of Ephesus. And you had many other instances of this happening in church history. And so this is just an illiteracy of the first millennium of church history.
And we'll talk about Constantinople 1 a little bit later down the road when we get to that.
Oh yeah, exactly.
They actually brought up Constantinople 1, but they actually show it themselves that sometimes you add disobedience to the papacy, and you add people putting themselves in schism with the papacy. There's a famous African schism, and they even quote Saint Cyprian of Antioch, Saint Cyprian of Carthage, who was in schism with the Pope because he didn't agree to the Pope. Why, if the Pope had all this authority that is just given to him, that if Saint Cyprian recognized that the keys of Peter were exclusive to Rome and were really demonstrating this power, why did he put himself, what was he in schism, why did he disagree with the papacy in the first place? There are many other means of presentation. There's one that's linking. At some point, they talk about the power quite a bit, and they are saying that they're making a prosperity gospel, basically, saying that the East fell to the Mohammedans. So because the East fell to the Muslims, that would mean that the East is not valid. But what he forgets once again is that when the East fell to the Muslims, they were under Rome as well. According to his own views, they were in commune with Rome. So it was the papacy as well, the papal jurisdictions which was attacked, and there's not a single today there's not a single Eastern Patriarchate that did not fall while it was not in commune with Rome. Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, even Constantinople. When Constantinople fell to the Muslims, it was under a Uniate emperor. So if I'm applying the same vision, I could easily say that it was only the papal East that fell. It will be ridiculous. He also forgets that a big chunk of the papal jurisdiction was eaten by the Muslims, namely North Africa, the home of Augustine, home of Saint Cyprian of Carthage, and all these great saints. He's saying that, to an extent, might is truth, might equal truth. What about the Muslim, which are very numerous? At some point, he commits the fallacy of number. This can apply to being more numerous, being more successful in evangelism would mean truth to an extent, and this could actually show that Protestantism is true or Islam is truth. And the Vatican acknowledges this because, for example, the Pachamama Synod was convened because the Protestants were actually gaining a lot of ground in the what is now the beating heart of Roman Catholicism, which is South America. He also comments on us not being able to evangelize, which is interesting because actually the church was united during the evangelism of the West. For example, the first barbarians. At some point, I mentioned that the barbarians converted to Catholicism. Actually, the only barbarian tribe that first entered. The first tribe that entered into the church. That was not Arian, basically, were the Franks, and the Franks did not convert to papacy. If you look at the conversion of Clovis, it is in the late 400s, and by 511, Clovis is already convening a council in which he declares that in order to join, in order to join the clergy, you need to be either the son of a clergy, which meant that these people who evangelized the West were not celibate, not only celibate, and that celibacy, contrary to what he claims, does not make for that celibacy is not the only way for evangelism. And also that it did not convert to the papacy because he will call it Caesaropapism, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later. He says, when did the Greek ever make such massive conversions as Rome did. Actually, there could be a point made that Greeks even managed to make conversion in the Roman jurisdiction, but the Greeks converted the entire Slavic race. They converted the Bulgars, they converted the Russian, etc., etc. And then he claims that yes, we converted people to the confines of the earth. Did you? Because what we're seeing right now is that it doesn't look like clean evangelism. It looks like syncretism, actually. Like what you're seeing with Pachamama is something that's been done for quite a while in the beating out of Roman Catholicism in Southern America and Latin America. You evangelize the Mexican with stuff like Santa Muerte. So this is more syncretism. So we just see the syncretic problem coming back to Rome. But can you really say he converted them?
And if we compare the two main sort of people groups that were the two largest people groups that both our churches evangelized, and although they would want to claim they evangelized Russia, it would be bizarre to think that just on the cusp of the schism, the Russians got the Catholic faith, considering they ended up siding the Roman Catholic faith, considering they ended up siding with Constantinople. But the Slavs, compare the quality of the Christianity that has been preserved amongst the Slavs to the quality of the Christianity preserved in the South Americans, which is the largest portion of Roman Catholics in the world. At 1 hour, 1 minute, 5 seconds, he does this numbers fallacy. But I mean, according to Taylor Marshall, surely the vast majority of Catholics who are modern Novus Ordo followers aren't really true, proper trad Catholics. So how much does this slice the numbers down, really, realistically?
And not to mention, only like I believe 33% of Catholics believe in the real presence, and even those, like if you count the people that actually go to church regularly every single week, only like 67% of them believe in the real presence. So what's the number of actual Roman Catholics, as you said? And when we're talking about the people they cited, it's very interesting how they never cite a actual respected Orthodox theologian. That's a huge strawman that they're attacking. They're citing heretics like Bulgakov, and they're citing people
Soloviev,
like
Bulgakov.
Bishop Ware, who's a Fordhamite. So they're citing the worst possible examples for orthodoxy, and they're pretending that this is the Orthodox standard. No, it's not the Orthodox standard. If I cited James Martin to refute Roman Catholicism, if I cited all the Jesuit homosexual bishops or priests in your church and said that's the standard, well, actually, I will actually kind of have a point because in your church these people are considered respected, but there's no citation of Father Florovsky, no citation of Father Stanilo. These are modern theologians. No citation of Vladimir Losky. And these are the normative modern Orthodox Christian theologians that we consider to be respected. But no, instead, who do we have? We have Bishop Ware, who again is a Fordhamite. Citations of Bulgakov, which I have no idea why people think citing Bulgakov against Orthodox works, because as I said, he's a Sophianist, he's a heretic, he's not Orthodox. So there's plentiful mistakes there. It's if these people were Iron Manning us, basically, if these people were representing the actual Orthodox position, I don't think they could have even made the stream, because the actual Orthodox position completely refutes Roman Catholic position. So what they do is that they show the worst examples of Orthodoxy. And again, if you try to do that for the Roman Catholics, we will have a field day. And I think we're going to have a field day using the best examples of Roman Catholics. The Pope himself, that they prayed that he converted. So the whole stream, they're talking about pride and how it's amazing that they have the papacy. But then in the same breath, they pray that the Pope is converted to the Roman Catholic faith. I mean, what's going on here? your Pope has a different faith than the Catholic faith. What's going on over here? How is this even possible?
It's that 56 minute that they're praying for Pope Francis to have a massive conversion.
Exactly, they're praying for a massive conversion. And Taylor Marshall even says that he won't go and have sacraments from the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is very strange because the Roman Catholic Church says that we have sacraments. Now, I'm not arguing for a very strict, hardcore, hyperdox position. I'm pointing out that one aspect of being in the church is sacramental certainty. So we have certainty of sacraments, we have certainty of grace in our church by the virtue of being the true church. So we can argue perhaps that certain other Roman Catholic churches might have grace, but that's a far cry from definitively saying that the Roman Catholic Church still has grace, because we have sacramental certainty, whereas the Roman Catholic Church say with certainty that we have the sacraments. And so by not going to our churches to have sacraments, if he has to, Taylor Marshall is actually disobeying the Roman Catholic pontiff. And this is throughout the stream. They will talk about how the papacy solves all of these problems. They will do papal lawyerdom and all that stuff. But then when the Pope says something that goes contrary against them, which is very interesting, throughout the stream, all they talk about is how in Orthodoxy is like Protestantism. Okay, but then anything that the Pope says that you don't like, you don't listen. So how is that? There's a double standard at play. And again, we're going to be talking about these double standards. But there's a huge double standard at play in throughout the stream. And I can't imagine that these people don't see this double standard. I think they do see it. They just ignore it because Rome gives them good feelings and whatnot.
One double standard that relates to the sacraments you were just speaking of was one of their early on critiques is at 22 minutes 38 seconds and 23 minutes 44 seconds, they say that, well, you see, some Orthodox, some Eastern Orthodox, they'll commune Copts, they'll commune the Oriental heterodox, and they don't really have a universal law on whether to commune with other churches. So they're essentially implying that it's up to the priest to decide whether or not he communes an atheist, a Muslim, or whatever. This is totally false. The whole concept of being in communion with someone is protecting the Eucharist, right? Only people you are in communion with will you commune. And this is contradictory in their position, in their argument, because they will talk about Constantinople and Moscow having a rupture in communion, which Moscow argues is a safeguarding of communion. So they put a lot of effort into protecting the communion. It's ironic they make this double standard argument because apparently their so-called universal law on who can commune and who can't doesn't help them so much when they have Eucharistic ministers who, I kid you not, I have seen with my own eyes, will literally hand their Eucharist to Sikhs, Muslims, atheists, no questions asked, to consume or throw in the trash can or drop on the floor. So who really is protecting the Eucharist in this circumstance?
And they love talking about it's like this. I'll talk about the show, but they love talking about how we have abuses in our church as well, which is laughable because here's the thing. Here's where their argument stems from. The whole argument is that we have the papacy, we have a better temporal church structure. That means we can safeguard ourselves from heterodox doctrine and heterodox abuses in our church. Now that claim needs evidence. And what better evidence will be than that will be the best evidence in that case will be reality itself. What we see in reality is that you have Eucharistic ministers, which is a sacramental abuse, and in Orthodoxy, you don't have Eucharistic ministers. Even in the worst kinds of churches, you still have a proper liturgy, whereas the average Roman Catholic Church is still Novus Ordo, which I'm 100% sure that Taylor Marshall himself considers as heterodox. We still have a proper liturgy. We still have a proper worship in church. We still have proper sacraments done in the church, even in the worst kinds of churches. And so this begs the question, if our church structure really is indeed inferior, then why is it the case that in the Roman Catholic system you have more abuses? Shouldn't the better structure also be protected from these abuses? Supposedly we don't have any proper dogmatic way to affirm things, and we're going to be talking about these things later on, but if that's real, let's say we accept that, then how can they explain all of the abuses going on in the Roman Catholic Church? The answer is they can't, because in their own argumentation, actually, we have the better church structure, not them.
Yeah, and it's made evident because, like, they're saying that, at least we have the Pope, we have a centralizing authority, we can see what is right. But at the same time, and here it's at 1 hour and 19 minutes, they say that Rome is failing, and even that Rome is working against the truth. So what is the point to have a Pope to determine the truth if ultimately you believe that the Pope is working against the truth? And like, if you say that, follow, like, you need to kill your pride in following the Pope, why are you writing all these books, Marshall? Because that's all what your books are about. Or why is Flanders actually saying that we need to follow the Pope, and that's what kills pride? And at the same time, he will tweet that we need the intercession of Mary as the co-redemptrix, even though the Pope clearly stated in a press release not so long ago that the co-redemptrix is foolishness. So this will enter into the ordinary magisterium. Even Marshall, when he says that Rome is working against the truth, he is working as a magisterium, because the magisterium states that the Pope cannot take bad decisions in terms of discipline.
Yeah, you actually have to obey what the Pope says, even if it's normie magisterial teaching. So even if the Pope says that you should have immigrants in your country or any other stuff that makes no sense in your view, you still have to obey what the Pope says. And which is very ironic, because again, throughout the stream they will talk about how, I just obey the Pope and it kills my pride. But when the Pope says something they don't like, they just don't obey it. And again, this is very inconsistency throughout the whole stream, and it's made us crazy while watching the stream, because in the same breath they will just go against what they're saying. So do we have anything more to add? Because if not, we can move on to Economia, because they had very abusive statements about Economia and such. So do you guys have anything more to add, or should we just move on?
So I think that pretty much covers most of the double standards. Some more might come up later.
Yeah.
I'm happy to segue into the Economia. When they talk about baptism, reception into the church.
Mm-hmm. So
I think we'll move on. We'll cover the rest of their disobedience towards the Pope in the papal stuff.
Yeah, we'll do the papal stuff after the Economia stuff.
So one good way to segue is that right off the bat, Tim claims that Economia is not the way of the seven councils, which is a very weird statement. I mean, you see Economia even in the Old Testament, and the best example of this is Moses.
Oh, by the way, David, sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
When we were talking about communion abuses,
it
would be good to put up that comment Taylor Marshall put in his stream about so-called trans people receiving.
Oh yeah. So Taylor Marshall, that's I don't have the image with me now, but he says that apparently we let transgender people commune in Orthodox Church, and he says, just look it up. I'm just saying, look it up on Google, and nothing comes up on Google. We don't know what he's talking about. In terms of Economia, the best example in the Old Testament will be Moses. Why did Moses permit divorce? Now, this isn't us trying to be subversive and saying, divorce is actually good, blah, blah, blah. Why did Moses permit divorce? Well, Christ actually says Moses permitted divorce because your hearts were hard. And if that is not Economia, then I have no idea what Economia is. No one has any idea what Economia is. And it's a concept that existed in the Old Testament, whereas in the Roman Catholic Church you don't have any understanding of Economia. As a matter of fact, in the liturgy, in the Roman Catholic liturgy, if you do one step wrong, if you do something very minor wrong when you're preparing the Eucharist, that whole thing is just, it's just invalid. It doesn't happen. So everything has
This
to be
isn't
completely
like really old trad liturgical rubrics. Yeah.
it has to be completely formulaic and perfect. If it's not, then it's blown. So you have some kind of a Talmudic legalism in the Roman Catholic structure, and when they see some sort of flexibility in Christianity, not even Orthodoxy, I'm talking about Christianity, I'm talking about Old Temple Judaism, I'm talking about the time of the prophets. When you have concepts of economia back then, they just scoff it. It just doesn't exist anymore. And so that will be one of the many things that's against economia that they talked about. I believe
Since you mentioned Moses, should we talk about the remarriage stuff?
Remarriage
and then we can talk about
baptize. Yep.
Yeah, so at 2930, Marshall blames Eastern Orthodoxy for for Pope Francis's liberalizations in the Roman Catholic Church. And at 3156, Timothy talks about how in Orthodoxy apparently we allow four marriages. That is, one marriage and then 3 remarriages. He says that he has a citation from John Meyendorff, but he doesn't give it. So, I mean, as far as I'm aware, I've never heard of 4 marriages. What I do know about is 1 marriage and 2 remarriages tolerated at the extreme case. Very, very extreme case. And the remarriages are usually penitential. They're increasingly penitential. So there has to be a penance. And this isn't just something we make up, right? It's part of the canons, Eastern canons, which are originating with St. Basil, in fact. So at 3301, Timothy talks about these, he says that, well, the Eastern Orthodox, they keep telling me about these sources that contain, remarriage, but they're just these really obscure Greek sources that are yet to be touched, which is total nonsense. In fact, we will link in the description an entire florilegium, probably the biggest florilegium online, which is brand new, from Ubipetrus, Ibi Ecclesia, WordPress, of all to our knowledge. It's a living document, so you can add to it if you find more, of all the different views of the fathers and early patristic writers on divorce and remarriage. So some will say no divorce outright. Some will say divorce, but no remarriage. Some will say divorce, but you can only remarry if your spouse is dead. Some will say you can divorce and remarry while your spouse is still alive, on the basis of sexual immorality. And then some will say divorce and remarriage with slightly more liberal allowances. So we'll include that link in the bottom. Now would be a good time to talk about the annulments. How does the Orthodox system of divorce and remarriage compare to annulments, David?
Well, I will say, if you look at the rules of these things, well, if you take the mask off of what annulment is, it's really just divorce, but in a very legalistic way, divorce, right? So they talk about how the annulment is basically saying, the marriage actually never really happened. It never really happened because it didn't fit the conditions of how a proper marriage is. But those conditions are very vague. And if you take the mask off of what annulment really is, we start to realize that annulments are actually a lot more liberal than divorces. Now, what makes us special in that regard, we actually do have the courage to say that a divorce is a divorce. The Roman Catholic system does not have that courage. They instead, again, hide it up with Talmudic legalism and say, the marriage actually never happened. There wasn't any interior consent of one of the parties during the marriage. And as you will point out, before the annulment even happens, for any Roman Catholic, that marriage is is legit. It's a legit marriage. But after the annulment, suddenly it never was legit. And that will also raise an epistemic question. That epistemic question being, how can you be certain of any marriage that you're in? How can you be certain as a Roman Catholic that you're actually married to your spouse? You can never be certain, because there's always a possibility of an annulment, possibility of it actually never being a proper marriage, and both of you just wasting each other's time. And you can have infinite amounts of annulments, because as I said, the marriage never happened, right? It wasn't a real marriage. So you can have an infinite amount of annulments, and especially in those sort of churches, well, guess what? They probably are making a lot of annulments in Novus Ordo churches and giving it freely, willy-nilly, because the ambiguity of those conditions, because they're so ambiguous, anyone can just change it as much as they want. And what was it that they said about us? We are Protestants? That seems a lot more Protestant than anything else. Having ambiguous rules and interpreting according to your own image.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to me like sola scriptura, except it's kind of like sola canons.
Yeah, and you can look them up as well. If you just Google grounds for annulment in Roman Catholicism, and you'll get these miasma of pages of different conditions. And if you Google grounds for divorce in Orthodoxy, there'll be like 5 or 6.
Well, okay. If you look at the most permissive grounds for divorce, probably is the one from the Catechism of Saint Philart of Moscow, and it basically boils down to 2 reasons. One that is biblical, it's in case of adultery, and the other one. So basically, you have several reasons, but it basically boils down to people being at a risk for their life. So, if the husband is drunk, if there is violence, if there is violence against the children, if there is a specific contagious disease that could actually kill one of the spouses or the children. So, in that case, we can see that Economia applies unless you really want to tell a woman that she has a sacramental duty to, get beat up or by an alcoholic father. A bit more on divorce. I actually super chatted Marshall because he actually, I think he learned something during this debate. Flanders actually told him that you had popes that allowed remarriage if one spouse is dead. But I thought that the triad vision is that a marriage is forever. So what happens? Does that mean that there is a second marriage? Does that mean that it's fornication? And actually, popes went way further. Pope Eugenius II allowed divorce and remarriage if
that's in the document.
If both spouses are still alive, if there is adultery. So this is a new doctrine of faith and morals. This was done during the Council of Rome. I think it's in 826.
826. Yeah, it's in the WordPress link blog.
How is that not ex cathedra? If it wasn't practiced before, it would mean that this is a new doctrine of faith and morals to be held by the whole church. That's interesting. Something else that yes, in trying to hide behind annulment, they're actually recreating heresies, because you basically are faced with Schrodinger's adultery. You don't know if the sacraments you took was valid in the first place, because it, if it fails, it might be annulled. If that really happens, it just means you're back being a Donatist. It means that you have no certainty when you have your marriage being celebrated, when you receive the sacrament of marriage. You have no certainty that the marriage that the sacrament is being performed. Something else is that, as David pointed out, yes, this is pick and choose, a bit Protestant, but it's more Protestant because they will say that in that case, the person who actually performs the marriage is not the priest, is not the person who has a sacramental power, which by the way are the keys. But it is the spouses. So the spouses have the keys to bind and unbind. And this is also a very Protestant vision. It's actually the vision that, simply making the act regarding of your capacity as a priest is performing the sacraments. It's exactly the things that evangelicals do, Baptists do, when they perform their own sacraments. So here you see Roman Catholicism opening the gate for the Protestants, and they do it in many ways through their own innovations. For example, when they, and here I'm talking about Eucharistic abuse again, in a sense, when they say that children cannot be commune. Children cannot commune. Like, you need to, in Roman Catholicism, you need to wait before your first communion, and then you need to wait before you actually have your chrismation. By saying that you need to, wait before the age of reason in order to be received fully into the church, to get chrismated and to participate in the church, you are using the same argument as Protestant. Actually, it's the Protestant who took it from you. You opened the gate for this. That's why they say that they will not baptize people. They will not baptize children until they have reached the same age of reason.
And one other thing to mention is that, again, he cites Callistus Ver on contraception, and I think that will kind of be a good segue to kind of like a short interlude on contraception and remarriage and stuff. Where on the first editions he was more hard line, he was more orthodox, Bishop Ver, but in the later editions he became more liberal. So this is not so. The change in Callistus Ver, he interprets it as a change in Orthodox dogma and doctrine. And again, if he actually cited actual real theologians that are not Fortamites, that are not liberals, he will probably not make this argument. But he is focusing on the worst kind of people that we have in Orthodoxy and just saying, this is Orthodoxy. This is what Orthodoxy is. And in terms of contraception, this is going to be a short interlude. We're not going to spend too much time on it. They attack us by saying, oh, you have contraception is debated in Orthodoxy. Well, what about natural family planning, Lewis? That's something that you have over them.
Well, I would personally argue that natural family planning is a form of contraception. I mean, you specifically plan your cycles to avoid conceiving, and this isn't just something I'm just arguing for because I have to, but this is in the fathers as well. When the fathers condemn contraception, they even condemn doing basically the rhythm method, as it were, engaging in relations at certain periods to avoid conception. This is something that the fathers also condemned. So that is what I would say about NFP. And in fact, the Diamond Brothers point this out, ironically. The Demon Brothers, they have a big essay on their site citing the fathers, citing papal second millennium papal sources condemning NFP. And they call out the Novus Ordo Vatican II Church for tolerating NFP, and they would condemn it as a form of contraception on the basis of these documents. So that's what I'd say about that. I mean, it's whether you prevent conception by natural means or by artificial means. It's not in terms of the ethic of the act itself. There's not an enormous difference. In terms of success rates, the NFP, if done properly, is actually better at preventing conception than a condom is, for example.
And also one thing to note is that I will say that it's logically inconsistent to be fine with NFP and not fine with any other form of contraception, because you're just basically being arbitrary. You're saying, oh, NFP is fine. That's the good kind of contraception. The others, they're the bad kinds of contraception. Well, wait, what's going on? They're both, in effect, the same thing. They both have the same result. They both have the same aim. It's not as if the means are entirely different either. One of them is just manipulating the cycles of your spouse. The other is just manipulating reproductive organs by using different artificial usages. So they're both basically the same thing, and it's ultimately arbitrary to say one of them is fine and the other isn't. But we know why this is the case, because a lot of the tradcasts want to remain traditional, right? They have this traditional dream where my religion has all the good social laws, and I'm gonna pretend that I live by those social laws, and that's my religion, and that's why we're seeing such an opposition to contraception, even though the same people have no problem with natural family planning. And
Yes,
mhm.
there could even be a case for natural family planning being close or related to onanism. And talking about, um, holding to our discipline, at 35 minutes, as they're saying that, this economia is actually infiltrating the morality of the Roman Catholic Church. And actually, what we can see and what we can, like, when we look at it historically, especially for a priestly marriage or divorce, is that there is tradition, and tradition itself is not held to a standard so hard that people cannot follow it. Otherwise, there would be no point in it. And then you have the later Roman additions to it, which is a bit of Pharisaic discipline. And even when we look at the Council of Nicaea, in the Acts of the Council of Nicaea, and Father Josiah Trenham has a wonderful video about Roman Catholicism when he talks about this. There's a father of the desert, because there's at that time there's discussion on married clergy, if people should divorce, or people who already are married can join the clergy, and or be a bishop even. There's a father of the desert who actually comes forth and say, by doing this, even if it's not a bad discipline, you would set yourself to a standard that is higher than the one of the apostles, which means that tradition apparently told them that some apostles still lived with their wives. But this is not that it's necessarily bad, is that it is Pharisaic in idea, that it is setting yourself to a holier than thou standard, and actually contradicting tradition.
Yeah. Now might be good to move on to reception into the church.
Caesar-Papism.
I thought we could keep talking about Economia a bit in terms of reception of
Of heretics and historically. Yeah. Go on.
Yes. So if you're interested in this in depth, somewhat in depth, sufficiently to get the idea, you should watch Father John Whiteford on Reason and Theology, his interview on baptism. Sorry, give me a sec. So yeah, they say, so Timothy says at 28 minutes that the MP gives you the option for baptism or economy, i.e. chrismation. But I'm not aware of that happening at all. Like, I don't know a priest that would say, "Oh, would you prefer to be blah baptized or chrismated?" I'm not aware of that. What I am aware of is of priests kind of feeling out the situation of the convert, what form of their baptism was, how long ago they were baptized, how much recollection they have of it, and then informing the bishop of this, and the bishop making a decision, because the decision ultimately lies in the bishop, because he has the keys to bind and loose. But the accusation is that rebaptism is completely, solved by Pope Stephen and Saint Cyprian in the 3rd century. Well, this is odd, because some of the North African Synod canons of Carthage made their way into the Trullan Synod, which is received at Nicaea II, which is Ecumenical Council, and also reaffirmed at the not Trullo, but some of these canons relating to reception of converts and heretics in the 6th Ecumenical Synod. And I'm just using one canon for an example of this, but in Canon 95 of the 6th Ecumenical Synod, it talks about the reception of different heretics. Now, we pretty much know that these heretics would have had what Roman Catholics would consider to be a valid baptism. That is a baptism that had matter, form, and intention, i.e. there's the water, the immersion into the water, the invocation of the Holy Trinity, and the intention to remit the sins of the penitent. But many of these heretics that are received back into the church are received by rebaptism. The text of Canon 95 of the Sixth Ecumenical Synod specifically says to receive them by rebaptism. So it's not quite as simple as the Roman Catholic view would let it on to be. Things are a lot more complicated, and that's why I recommend the Father John Whiteford interview, because he will discuss that with Ybarra and Lofton.
And speaking of Ybarra, he said that Ybarra is the top apologist, and I believe you have a lot of sources against some of the funny stuff that Ybarra did, Lewis.
Well, yes. So on the Ubipetrus blog, there are so at 42 minutes 40 seconds, Tim Flanders says Eric Ybarra is the best apologist for Rome, or one of the best. But we will also link this. Some from an exchange between Ubipetrus and Ybarra. Ubipetrus will point out that Ybarra actually plagiarizes in his response in an exchange on the Tome of Leo. So Eric Ybarra plagiarizes. How is it that your best apologist plagiarizes? Bizarre. Anyway.
Yeah, and Eric Ybarra is quite dishonest. We've had debates with him, private debates on my Discord actually, and he was faced with some arguments, especially regarding the Council of Constantinople, which we'll bring up a bit later. Which actually, like, there's no way you can remain, you can adhere to the idea of extra ecclesia nullum, like no salvation outside the church after learning about the Council of Constantinople. And he actually says that when we were presenting him with Orthodox Ecclesiology, he said that he didn't see it in any of the Orthodox theologians that he read about, and we actually told him that it's part of a very well-known book by Jean-Claude Larcher. For 2 days, he told us that he didn't know of Jean-Claude Larcher, he didn't know about this book, and that opposition was simply unorthodox. And on the third day, he told us that, I've been having mail conversation with Jean-Claude Larcher for months now, before promptly leaving the chat room before any recording could have been done. I don't know if you want to keep that in. That's something interesting with Ybarra.
Yeah, one thing I will actually add is that I also saw Ybarra talking in voice chat, and he said that this is kind of off topic, but he said that posthumous condemnations don't count in Roman Catholicism anymore, which is very strange because, again, these people will talk about how they kept the faith traditionally speaking, but then the Fifth Council, which is convened by Saint Justinian, the Fifth Ecumenical Council, posthumously condemned various people. So Origen is one of them. And the Sixth Council, I believe, condemned John the Grammarian, who also was part of the Fifth Council, by the way. It condemns John the Grammarian posthumously. But all of those condemnations, they don't actually count. So they used to count in the 6th century, in the 7th century, but now they don't count anymore. So that just begs the question, do you have a changing of dogmas, you have a changing of rules in Rome, which we'll get to later about doctrinal development. But I think that was kind of important to mention that, in Rome, you don't have a proper set of rules. And do we have more to cover, or should we move on to case or papers?
You should just add that, of course, if they say that a posthumous condemnation don't work, is because they retroactively had to say so, because Pope Honorius was actually condemned posthumously for heresy at the Fifth Council. So, of course, when you bring up this idea of
Sixth.
Sixth or fifth?
I believe it was sixth.
There was
the
sixth.
Yeah. Monophysite controversy.
So when this happens, of course, and you introduce the idea of papal infallibility, you have to retro-engineer your own set of rules in order for it to fit, because otherwise it will mean that a pope taught heresy, which actually invalidates the entire papal scheme, especially after Vatican I.
So do you want to talk about Caesaropapism or
Yeah.
arguments or the arguments they
Yes.
make for the papacy in history?
Yeah, we can cover the arguments for papacy later.
Okay.
Caesaropapism will be pretty short. So one thing I would like to note in when we're talking about Caesaropapism is that they accuse us of being Caesar-papist, both pre-schism and post-schism, by the way. Now, but they also claim that we don't have a universally binding dogmatic figure. And that's why we can't make any dogmatic decisions, and that's why we don't have any dogmas in Orthodoxy. But wait a minute. So the emperor is our pope, but at the same time we don't have a universally binding dogmatic figure that can settle theological matters. These are two mutually exclusive positions. Choose one of them. Use one of them as an argument. Are you going to say that we're Caesar or Papist, or are you going to say that we don't have a universally dogmatically binding figure? Choose only one of them, because both of them together as an argument makes you look like a Muslim. It's like the Muslim argument of, the Bible doesn't speak of Christ as God. If it does, I mean, the Bible is corrupt anyway. You can only choose one of these arguments. You can't choose both in conjunction. And we will say that there is an orthodox understanding of the emperor, of the social states working in conjunction in symphonia with the church. And if you look at the ecumenical councils, were they all called by the Pope? Were they all finalized by the Pope? No, they were all called by the emperor. So the best example will be the Council of Ephesus, why was the Council of Ephesus dogmatic? Why was it ratified? Was it because of the Pope? Actually, no, it was because of the emperor. So not many people know this, but after the Council of Ephesus, you had another council, which was the Nestorian Ephesian Council, conducted by John of Antioch and many other Antiochian Christologists. And ultimately, the decision was not left to the Pope, because the Pope already was supporting the Kyrillene Council of Ephesus. But the ultimate decision for one of those councils to be ratified and dogmatized was left to the emperor. And the emperor even initially wanted to dogmatize the Nestorian Council, but ultimately what ended up being dogmatized was the Kyrillene Council. And so practically speaking, that's how Ephesus was dogmatized. It's not because the Pope said it to be so and then it was dogmatized. None of that sort of happened. So in that logic, if you try to do the Roman Catholic exegesis, that should mean that the pre-schism church is Caesar-Papist. But no, we won't say that the church was Caesar-Papist, but we will talk about a symphonia. And this concept is completely lost in Roman Catholicism, where you have two really different positions. So at times, the emperor will be above the Pope, and at other times, you will have the Pope be above the emperors and the kings. And so it will just be a tidal wave just going on and on and on and on. You have the Gallican Church that will basically tell the Pope, hey, the king is going to select the bishops and the clergy, not you. And then you had the Pope saying, I'm above the kings. And then you had the Council of Constance, where it literally says, and this was dogmatized at the time, literally says that a council is above the Pope. And by the way, this council elected a new Pope, by the way. So it was actually conducted by an anti-Pope too, and it elected in the Roman Catholic view, a legitimate Pope. So you have all of these instances happening in Roman Catholic papacy, and this kind of went onto the tangent, but I think these are all very related, and it's a good comparative way for us to understand church ecclesiology. And we will get to that in more detail. We will talk about receptionism later on. Do you guys have anything more to add, or should we move on?
On Caesar-Papism, there's so much to talk about, mostly because it's a double standard. It seems that Caesar-Papism is any interaction between the church and the Byzantine Empire in the east, but when it happens in the west, there's absolutely no problem with it. Here I'm directing towards Saint Gregory of Tours, which was a Frankish saint. And if you look at his book and the history of the Franks, you can see that the organization of the church, according also to what I quoted from the Council of Orleans in 511, it is pretty much Byzantine Symphonia. and Byzantine even recognized it. It was not under papal jurisdiction. You can look, like, even mentions that Caesaropapism happened in the West. He talks about the investiture controversy, which means that yes, at some point it was the Holy Roman Emperor, the Germanic Emperor, who would come down to Italy, pick a pope, and get his crown, and that's what happened. And actually, the first time the Filioque was ever sung in the presence of the Pope was during the coronation of Otto I. Before that, the papacy opposed it, and that's why, when they start saying that. And we're going to cover that a bit later, but when they start saying that the papacy actually supported the Filioque, when you really look at it, they fought against it quite adamantly. Leo III even convened counter-council to the Council of Charlemagne that added the Filioque to the creed, and it was only very late. So the coronation of Otto the First was 962, so it's relatively late. That Rome actually added the Filioque, and again, in calling out what they believe is Caesaropapism, they're actually disregarding a whole part of the history. If you look at the history of the church in France, or even some parts of the church in Germany, they always operated with some level of Caesaropapism. Like, you can look, even Louis XIV declared himself to be the lieutenant of God. Even Saint Louis refused to grant exile to the Pope. They refused to grant him asylum. You had kings supported by the French clergy who refused Jesuit who came in the name of the Pope. You even had kings who sent hit squad against the papacy. You had the papacy being puppeted by a variety of states. Do you know that, for example, during the barbarian invasions, the papacy, like actually the king of the Ostrogoths, could veto a pope and would sometimes select him. You have bids to vassalize the papacy, which apparently are fine. For example, the donation of Pepin. Because if the papal state exists, it's not because donation of Constantine, or it's not because Peter came to Rome claiming he's a king. It's because Pepin the Short, came in and granted, the title of, he granted titles, landed titles to the Pope, and that's when the Pope starts to mix Caesar and God. So all these not instances of Caesaropapism. Why is Caesaropapism any interaction between the Eastern churches in communion with Rome, by the way, and Byzantium? But when the same thing happens in Europe, it's fine. And if Caesaropapism is heresy, does it mean that you are again saying the entire Eastern Church always was heretical? Okay, I can deflect this back to you. Caesaropapism, I think that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything more to add, Lewis?
Nope. No.
All right. This will be a great time to move into Or Saints. This is an argument that Tim used against us, and he said, "What would you say to the Orthodox who say that we don't need the Pope, well, so on and so forth? What would you say to them?" And Tim X says, "Your saints teach papacy." And some of the
38
and
minutes
the examples and the examples they used. Pope Saint Victor, I'll let Lewis handle it, about that, and I'll handle the objection of Pope Saint Leo, which I know about. So what is it about Pope Saint Victor that they said, and what is it about Pope Saint Victor that completely actually refutes their argument?
So in short, this issue is a bit more detailed. I hope to have an article about this published on Ubipetrus, but not so sure just yet. Eventually, but in short, and Snek can add to this. The Roman Catholic would say that Pope Victor threatened to excommunicate the whole of Asia Minor over the issue of the date of Easter, because they had the different date of Easter. And then they would say that, no one told him he didn't have the authority to do it. There's a number of problems with this, and we can just read Eusebius to see what he says. So Eusebius in the History of the Church, book 5, 24, says, Victor, Pope St. Victor, who presided over the Church of Rome, immediately attempted to cut off from the common unity the parishes of all Asia, with the churches that agreed with them as heterodox. And he wrote letters and declared all the brethren there wholly excommunicate. So he declared them to be excommunicate, right? So supposedly this decision is supposed to go through because the Pope decided it. But this did not please all the bishops, and they besought him to consider things of peace and of neighborly unity love. Words of theirs are extant, sharply rebuking Victor. Among them was Irenaeus, Saint Irenaeus, who, sending letters in the name of the brethren in Gaul over whom he presided, maintained that the mystery of the resurrection of the Lord should be observed only on the Lord's day. He fittingly admonishes Victor that he should not cut off the whole churches of God, which observe the tradition of ancient custom. So we see Pope Victor try to excommunicate, and then Irenaeus rebukes him and says, don't do that, even though he had already put the excommunication through. So when does this get solved? Does it get solved by the Pope in the 2nd century? No. We have to wait another 100 years until the Council of Nicaea, long after Pope Victor is dead, to set the date of Easter. But on Vatican I view, surely the Pope would make the decision, and then the Asia Minor churches would simply submit and change the date to the correct date declared by the Pope. Case in point.
And two things to mention here. One of those things is that this completely refutes the fake Orthodox, by the way, this sort of attitude from Saint Irenaeus about those that worship Easter on a different day. So that completely refutes them. But it also, one interesting thing is this is contradictory to what they were talking about in the stream. Again, they were talking in very fake, pious language that the Orthodox Church constantly schisms, right? We just constantly fight with each other. We don't have love and all that kind of nonsense. But then, in the same breath, he's talking about how amazing it is that Saint Victor excommunicated an entire region in their view. So it's so amazing that the Pope excommunicated an entire region, but the Orthodox are evil because they constantly schism with each other, even though, the examples of constant schism, what are those? Well, EP and Moscow, which is not even a formal schism because both of them are still in the line, in the communion line throughout other patriarchates, and also with the examples they give about Saint Victor, right? And so this is completely contradictory. They say one thing and then they go against the thing that they talked about. And we want consistency. Where is the consistency? Just talking about the Pope is not going to grant you consistency. You have to be consistent. And ultimately speaking, they are not consistent because it's an inconsistent position. Do you guys have anything more to add, or should I move on to Pope St. Leo?
Yeah, I have something to add.
Good.
If you look at if Vatican I was in effect and retroactive, as it claims, the fact that the acts would be written, like that the letters would be written, would mean that the decision already took effect. But here we can see that Irenaeus comes and rebukes, so the letters were not in effect. Another point is that the fact that the Pope sends letters to another jurisdiction, excommunication letter to another jurisdiction, doesn't mean that he has supremacy, because you literally have bishops, whenever they see a problem in another jurisdiction, they will actually send letters of anathematism throughout church history. And lastly, and I want to make a small I want to talk about Vladimir Soloviev quite a bit, because here the main point of Flanders is that, as David mentioned, schisming is always being uncharitable. First of all, you're again forgetting the first 1,000 years of history, vindicating more point that we actually are the United Church and you are not, because every council addresses heresy inside the church, and every council removes it from the church itself. So here you see each of the 7 councils removed heresy. And you actually talk about the same thing at the end of your stream. You say that you wish that something that will never happen, but you wish that the Pope becomes trad, converts to the same religion as you, that all the bishops follow the Pope, and that you can push out what you call the 5%. Today it's not a 5% problem in your church. You are the 5% problem for the Pope. Something that's interesting is that so about this thing about pride, so Soloviev that is quoted profusely by Flanders actually as the idea that any schism is being uncharitable, and he was a huge ecumenist. So that's the first thing. Like you can't really claim to be trad and be ecumenist. This man was involved to some level of occultism, to some level of Russian Freemasonry. And what's interesting is that you talk about our house being in fire, but the first symptom of ecumenism and fire being present in our house, people who actually display the symptoms, the first reflex they have is to go look at Freemason Central, your church. Something else is that according to Soloviev, it is the Greek and the Russian church, so basically the Eastern Orthodox, who schismed from Rome. But let's look who has pride in this schism. The schism of 1054 starts at the behest of the Pope. So it's the Pope who actually sends in the anathema, and the anathema are not sent in by virtue of the patron primacies, are sending by virtue of the donation of Constantine, which today your church recognizes is a forgery, a fake document. So first of all, it's done with a wrong authority. Secondly, this letter of anathematism covers 3 points. The first point is the removal, I'm quoting here, removal of the filioque from the creed by the Greeks. And today, if you go see, the official paper stance is that no, is actually it was added, and that's something very funny because at the beginning, Flanders says that there is a need to conserve the Nicene Creed, but you modified it. It was modified despite the canons of Chalcedon saying that you cannot modify the creed. So this is one argument for this is one cause for the schism, which is wrong. The second one is priests being married, and as we've discussed before, it actually is tradition that that married men can become priests in the church. And the last one is the use of leavened bread, which is biblical. The original New Testament attests to this use, and tradition attests to the use of leavened bread, as opposed to the Judaic practice of unleavened, which is still linked with Levitical law, animal sacrifice, and is criticized in the Toulon Council, which is approved by popes later on. So, and by the way, both priestly marriage and the use of leaven are today in full communion with Rome through the Uniats, and it's been quite a long time. It's not a Vatican II thing. It's
but it's been since Council of Florence, actually.
Yeah. So if you look at it, you're saying that we schism because of our pride, and what really is the case is that the schism was done, and this is according to the papacy today, according to a wrong authority for 3 wrong pretenses. So actually, who is wrong in this schism? Who is the prideful one? And it was also started by the Pope. So yes, this argument of pride advanced by Soloviev is not really honest when you look at the historical facts, even the ones supported by Rome. Closing point on Vladimir Soloviev, his main point was that unity, that the East would be, according to him, too mystically focused on the divine, too focused on the divine, whereas he recognized Rome, and he's an ecumenist. He recognized Rome as a humanist institution. that should bring together humans. And what he wanted was a world government of the churches, and Christian unity. And here you see that he was advocating for unity, not in truth, but unity in political unity only. And we'll see that it is what Rome has been doing, and it's absolutely not what is taught to us by the Father, by the Church, and even by the Bible. The Bible says you cannot mix Christ with Mammon, with other divinities. You cannot mix faith. And Christ Himself, tells that there will be schisms, that families will be broken in the name of Christ. So again, I'm not making a point for a schism. I'm making a point for unity, but unity can only be achieved in truth. It cannot be achieved politically. And here, what's the point, of searching for unity above all costs? It's a bit hypocritical from Christians, because let's look at the first persecution. When Rome persecuted the Christian, they also wanted unity. They wanted the Christian to join the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. So they did not kill us. They did not martyr Christians for worshiping Christ. They martyred Christians for not accepting the other God alongside Christ. And that was a problem. So by your metric, do you think that the first Christians, who were getting martyred, were prideful because they did not accept to the Roman rites? Because they did not accept to the Roman pagan rites? Because they did not seek political unity? Political unity, Christ talks about it. It says that we shouldn't really care about Caesar. We should care about him, Christ, and the faith. And actually, the unity, political unity, is something that is associated with the Antichrist. So here, we'll come back to this, but we are united in faith, whereas you are only united politically, and we'll discuss this regarding the Uniats. Anything to add, Lewis?
I would say that, so at 41 minutes and 10 seconds, they say that, quote, schism is like a sin against charity, and that, we need to stick and fight and, die as a Catholic and all this stuff. And they say that this is how their forefathers did it. But this isn't true. Maybe about some saints that died out of communion with Rome.
Yeah, actually, he brings this himself. But first of all, the idea of our father, having tradition, and therefore tradition is good. Like, father were Catholic, and please do not convert to Orthodoxy. Please die Catholic. This is ridiculous, because it's an argument that can be used to prove paganism, to prove Hinduism, to prove Islam, to prove any religion. And at some point, when he talks about church structure, he mentions the Council of Constantinople, and that what's very interesting is that the Council of Constantinople actually was convened in schism with Rome, because at the time, I think
it's the first Council of Constantinople, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the Second Ecumenical Council, it was convened in schism with Rome, and why so? Because it was after the Luciferian crisis. And there was Bishop Paulinus of Antioch, who was actually ordained by Lucifer of Cagliari, who was declared a schismatic. And Rome and Alexandria recognized Paulinus. Paulinus. And actually, there was another patriarch of Antioch, which was Meletius. And he convened a council to clarify a variety of things, most notably on the Holy Spirit. And this council was convened in schism with Rome, meaning that Rome was not allowed to participate. Rome was not even invited into this council. And yet, Meletius, who died during this council, became a saint, which means that he actually died in schism with Rome. And he was a saint. And this is like very early in church history. You see that, if you hold to the papal position, there is salvation outside the church. There is even sanctity outside the church, because Meletius not only apparently saved, according to the Romans as well, but he is also a saint. the council as well is ecumenical, and they will say that the council is ecumenical only because the Pope recognized it. But an ecumenical council means that a truth of faith during this council has been sealed by the Spirit, which is why we hold them to be infallible. And actually, the papal infallibility is just moving this Spirit seal from the council to the Pope only. So that means that the Spirit actually sealed the decision of truth in schism with Rome. It doesn't really matter at this point if Rome later accepted it as ecumenical, because
they believed it to be ecumenical.
By the way, speaking of canonizing saints that are outside the Roman Communion, there's in 1940 Pope Pius XII also canonized several Orthodox saints who are also in communion with the Orthodox churches and out of communion with Rome. So one of them will be Saint Sergei Radonesh, who died in full communion with the Russian Orthodox Church, and he was never a Roman Catholic. He never gave an interest to Roman Catholicism, and he was canonized by Pope Pius XII. So, if you're speaking about people being canonized outside the church, there's many instances of people being canonized by the Roman Pope. So how is that even possible?
So there is salvation outside the church, and there is sanctity outside the church, and there is ecumenical counseling outside the church. And I want to make a comparison. The fact that a council was declared ecumenical in schism with Rome totally contradicts the Roman magisterium. And like it's equivalent that if tomorrow Pope Michael, who's in full schism with Rome, convenes an ecumenical council, like he convenes a council and later Rome accepts it as ecumenical, would you accept it? It's what happened. A council in schism with Rome, the Holy Spirit working outside of communion with Rome. And regarding Pius XII canonizing those Russian saints, there is a cop-out saying that, actually they didn't really know they were in schism with Rome. So Sergei of Radonesh, who was part of who received his monastery from the Patriarch of Constantinople, who actually commemorated Saint Alexander Nevsky, who fought against the Papist Northern Crusade. Apparently, he wasn't really aware of the schism happening 400 years before his death.
But Taylor Marshall told me that there is no salvation out of the Catholic Church. So was he lying to me? I thought that destroyed ecumenism. I mean, you see historical examples throughout church history. Everything just completely refutes anything that they stand for. And here's another thing that completely refutes anything they stand for. If you look at more saints, supposedly teaching papacy, of course, we have Saint Augustine, which Tim claimed that we hate Saint Augustine. That's a very small minority position. Again, all he has is minority positions. He never deals with the majority position of orthodoxy. There's not a single thing that he talks about orthodoxy that is the majority position. So, in regards to Saint Augustine in theology, I mean, if you look at On the Trinity from Saint Augustine, he believes that's a trial, right? It's a trial work, and he admits that he probably made a lot of mistakes, and if anyone corrects him, he is welcome to correction. He says that on the Trinity, yet a lot of the stuff he wrote there are now received as dogmatic. If you look at his writings about Matthew 16:18, he considers every single bishop as holding the keys of Peter. Every single bishop holds the office of Saint Peter because Saint Peter is the first bishop. And because he's the first bishop, all bishops are a type of Peter. Now, this doesn't mean that we go to the other extreme and go full on. The Pope is just like another bishop, man, which is kind of a wrong position I think Orthodox hold. But it doesn't mean Vatican I. It absolutely does not mean Vatican I. But and this just proves that you have many saints in the pre-schism church that completely talks against the papacy, completely talks, even those like Saint Cyprian, who thinks that the rock in Matthew 16:18 is Saint Peter. Even he says that the same thing that Saint Augustine says. He says that Saint Peter is the first bishop. He is the type of all bishops, and so all bishops hold the office of Saint Peter. And in terms of Saint Leo, where Tim claims that we're supposed to consider Saint Leo as a pre-heretic. That's laughable. I mean, have you ever looked at the Council of Chalcedon? Of course you haven't, because he has no idea about the Monophysite schism. He has no idea about the Monophysite schism because he thinks we're the same, and he has no idea about Saint Leo. So here's something very interesting about the Council of Chalcedon that completely refutes Roman Catholicism. The standard of the Council of Chalcedon, contrary to what many of the Roman Catholics claim, was Saint Cyril of Alexandria. The best evidence is when you had, I believe, 49 bishops or 39 bishops, somewhere around those numbers. You had around 40, 50 bishops in the council opposing the Tome of Leo. Yeah. Opposing the Tome of Leo. They said,
we'll put an article link to that as well.
Exactly. And I mentioned this in a lot of different videos. They opposed the Tome of Leo, and what they did is they convened a team, I believe under Saint Anatolius, to basically investigate the Tome of Leo and cross-reference it with the writings of Saint Cyril of Alexandria. So the Tome of Leo was accepted not because it was ex cathedra like Eric Ybarra claims, and I will be completely honest, like a blubbering, I don't want to say meanie words, but basically someone who has no idea what he's talking about. Unlike what he claims, you have a 5-day research cross-referencing Saint Cyril of Alexandria with the Tome of Leo, and what do they say at the end? Peter spoke through Leo. Why? Because he taught the same thing as Saint Cyril taught. And so that begs the question. We know that the Tome of Leo was not accepted in the Robber Council of Ephesus. So why didn't... That begs the question. Why not just declaring it ex cathedra? Right? Why was it that Dioscorus rejected the Tome of Leo? As a matter of fact, Dioscorus also deposed many different bishops in the Robber Council. And for the decisions of the Robber Council to be reversed, what had to have happened? The Roman Catholic will say, oh, there needed to, the Pope St. Leo just said, this council is a Robber Council and everything is reversed, man. No, they had to hold a council. The council is the Council of Chalcedon. So you had people like Ibas of Edessa and Theodoret of Cyrus who were deposed by the Robber Council of Ephesus to reverse the decision. So even Robber Councils still had decisions made that had an effect in the ecclesiological world. So this is a complete refutation of the claims that are made. And they also talked about Acts 15. Now, again, even the Robber Council had supposed dogmatic statements, and those dogmatic statements were reversed and shown as being wrong in a council, not in a dogmatic statement by the Pope, not in a letter by Pope St. Leo. None of that sort happened. It was all through a council, just like how we still do things today. And it's entirely strange to me how people think that Council of Chalcedon vindicates papism when it actually does the opposite, when it actually goes against papacy. I mean, again, you have to bear with this question. Why is it the case that you had a council in Chalcedon that instead of just accepting the Tome of Leo, had to cross-reference it and use Saint Cyril of Alexandria as the standard of orthodoxy? To the point where if you look at the definition of faith of Chalcedon, the council, the Fourth Ecumenical Council, you have a sea of Cyrilline quotations, and you only have one quotation from the Tome of Leo. Only one. As compared to like 8 or 9 different quotations from Saint Cyril. Obviously, we know who the council is based on. It's based on Saint Cyril. And so
which is why Saint Cyril was removed by Cardinal Baronius, who was a papal supremacist.
And not to mention, another thing about Saint Cyril is that his 8th anathema is actually a complete anatomization of Sacred Heart. So yes, we do have a anatomization of Sacred Heart heresy. It's the 12 anathemas against Nestorius. In the 8th anathema, he speaks of a single doxology and a single adoration to Christ, whereas in the Sacred Heart, you have 2 different adorations and 2 different doxologies. You have one to Christ, the divinity of Christ, and then you have a component of his humanity, that being his heart. So you have anatomizations even in the pre-schism church against several doctrines from the Roman Catholic Church.
Yes. Yeah, and by the way, Cyril was putting some big shade on the Pope, which is why he was removed from the calendar of the saint at some point. That is from the general calendar of the saints in Rome. And now they say, oh, it's okay, we have it through the Uniates, but he was removed for a reason. There's some other problems. Yes, he mentions Acts 15, which again is a self-owned. First of all, he strawmans the Orthodox position, saying that before Nicaea, we didn't really have any way to have a council. We didn't have any authority because we were just getting martyred. It's false. We actually agree with the Council of Acts 15. And the Council of Acts 15 disproved papal primacy. Because here you can see in the Council of Acts 15, at some point, St. James, brother of Christ, who is the Bishop of Jerusalem, was actually a very prominent figure at this point, because according to some saints and some historians, he's the one who gives the priesthood, because he's a Levite priest, and he's the one who can interpret the law. Actually, it's St. James that is leading this council. And at some point, Peter speaks, but Peter speaks under the authority of James. It is James who say, no, you listen to Peter. Peter speaks, Paul speaks, all are in agreement, but it is James who makes the final declaration, which is not exactly the same thing as what Peter says. And the apostolic brief at the end of this council is actually proving is word for word what James said. Something else. They argue from the non-existence of something. So they say from the onset there is no papal controversies. Yes, because at the time the papacy, as you understand it, doesn't even exist. If you look at the council, like the very first council at Nicaea, the first ecumenical council, there is no proof of the papacy anywhere. There is actually a canon that says that Rome has extended jurisdiction over the West, but not universal jurisdiction, and it is not a jurisdiction that is given to Rome by virtue of patron supremacy. It is given by virtue of tradition, recognized by the council and only through the council. By the way, the same extended jurisdiction is given over Africa to the Patriarchate of Alexandria. So here you need to presuppose the papacy, and we show that the papacy, even the patron supremacy didn't exist during the First Apostolic Council at Acts 15. So you argue that there is no papal controversy when the papacy, as you understand it, doesn't exist at the time.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna.
I just wanted to say that he in the video, Flanders cites Adrian Fortescue, and Adrian Fortescue is a good scholar, but the Roman Catholic scholar. He's from the late 19th century. And early 20th century. But problem is that his scholarship on the papacy is very outdated now in modern scholarship. So if we look at something more up to date, like the Assembly of the Orthodox and Roman Catholic Scholars at Chieti 2016, Chieti, the joint agreement, paragraph 15 explicitly states that the Pope did not exercise jurisdiction over the churches of the East. But I thought this was the whole argument in the first place. So now we have to ask ourselves, well, if it never exercised it, then did it even have the authority in the first place? I think we've done one other thing I wanted to add was just that ecumenical councils, when they were convened, were intended to be ecumenical councils. They believed they were inspired by the Spirit, and they would demand the Pope to, well, not demand, but they would ask the Pope to sign the documents. That doesn't mean that if he refused Nicaea 1, then Nicaea 1 would be invalid. In fact, he would have been harshly rebuked, possibly even excommunicated for refusing to sign on to the First Council of Nicaea. And also, if papal ratification is the basis for ecumenical councils, then why is the Council of Lateran in 649 not an ecumenical synod? It was and this goes back a bit to Caesar Papacy, and then we'll move on. But St. Maximus and the Pope intended this council to be ecumenically binding, but the emperor wasn't involved. And then the church didn't recognize it as ecumenical, even though the Pope and St. Maximus thought it was. and then the Pope essentially, the Emperor kidnapped and brought Sir Maximus and the Pope to trial in in Constantinople. Is this really how the papacy functions? Surely all of the churches should have rebuked the emperor. I mean, we see later on in the papacy that the papacy claims that it has universal temporal jurisdiction over states and kings. This doesn't make sense.
Can you have a word on Pope Liberius on the same score?
Sure.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
You go ahead.
All right. Pope, like, if it is a fact that a pope convenes a council that makes it ecumenical, why does the church not recognizes the Council of Sirmium that were convened by Pope Liberius, and during which he actually wrote and signed a semi-Arian creed after Nicaea? Why is it not recognized? If it is a papacy that makes ecumenicity, if it's a papacy that makes truth, why is this council that was convened by Pope Saint Liberius not ecumenical? Why are you not semi-Arians today? Simple as, because the church actually rebuked him. He was shunned for a while. He was borderline exiled by bishops that were supposedly in his jurisdiction, and actually atoned, and that's why today he's a saint. Which actually matches, the idea that all patriarchs can fail, but doesn't match your ideas that a dogmatic statement in a council by a pope is binding and infallible. And that's what a lot of Roman Catholics don't understand, is that we are not comparing sees. We are looking at the faith at some point. Every single individual patriarchal see. It fell to heresy at some point. What we are about is the faith. So if tomorrow, Constantinople, promotes heresy, do we really care? No, it's about the faith. Of course, it would be very bad for us. But the Roman Catholic view is more about seeing it as patriarchal conflicts, and that's why they have no problem, talking about whatever happens in the East during the times where the Pope, during the United Church and divided Church. So the Pope should have authority over that, but it doesn't. Another point that I wanted to bring up is.
Well, before you do that, actually, Lewis kind of reminded me of something. I mean, if what makes truth is the Pope accepting that truth, I mean, if he just run just a game in our minds and just pretend that the Pope didn't accept the Council of Nicaea, the first Council of Nicaea, does that suddenly make Trinitarianism a wrong belief? I mean, the Council of Nicaea preaches truth because really it just preaches truth, right? The dogma of the Trinity didn't become dogmatized in the Council of Nicaea. It did get officially temporally dogmatized, but it was always the truth. And so this kind of notion that a lot of people have, a lot of Roman Catholics especially have, with truth only being found through dogmas is completely ludicrous. Many truths can be found. We don't have to rely on ecumenical councils to find out what exactly is true. I mean, what the councils do is investigation, right? They investigate in councils that deal with theological matters. Is that they investigate doctrines and make sure they're true or not. And what the church does is that if they accept that council wholesale, well, every single apostolic church will agree that the church is infallible. And so if a church wholesale agrees with a council, that just means that doctrines that the church preaches now is dogmatic and infallible. It doesn't matter if you have like a couple of minority heretics going contrary against that. The church still accepts and pronounces those teachings as dogmatic, as true, as infallible. And that will how we will ultimately know about what is true or what is not. And throughout many other things. This is not just receptionism, not the only way, but there's multitude of other ways. And I think we kind of have to mention the obvious. If papal ratification, if you're talking about papal ratification making a council ecumenical, then we have to talk about the Photian Synod at 879. The Pope at the time, in three separate instances, said that the Ignatian Council that convened 10 years before the Photian Council, the Ignatian Council was a robber council, and the Photian Council is the true council that reinstates Saint Photius. And in that council as well, as Father Dragus points out, that council also rejects the filioque. So Rome actually accepted the council and dogmatized the council that goes against the filioque. But 3 centuries later, suddenly we change our minds. Suddenly, it's actually wrong. So it's kind of like, it's in the same vein of accepting Trinitarianism, and then 20 centuries later, you come up with Quaternitarianism. Actually, there's another hypostasis in the Trinity, so it's actually like 4 persons. God is 4 persons. We just find them like through scientific inquiry or whatnot. It's kind of in the same vein. You just make doctrinal development, and the point I want to make regarding doctrinal development is that we don't have doctrinal development. The point with doctrinal development, even in the case of a best case interpretation, what it leads to is that you can never be certain of your dogmas and of your teachings. So you always have to ask yourself, okay, this is dogma, but is this dogma fully developed, or is it yet to develop? Are there certain truths that are yet to be covered about these dogmas, or is this dogma the full truth? And so you can never actually be certain of what dogma is. So you have 0 dogmas in that sense with doctrinal development, which is persistent through Roman Catholic history, and this we will say is a huge weakness in Roman Catholic system. It doesn't matter if you have the Pope, if the popes can just change their minds and then just like go against a teaching. Like for example, Saint Gregory Palamas. Saint Gregory Palamas was a heretic in the Roman Catholic view, but now suddenly he's a saint. What's going on over here? The same with Nestorius. Nestorius was a condemned heretic. But now it's through the Chaldean Catholic Church and the Syro-Malankara Church. Suddenly Nestorius is a Greek father and he's a saint. What's going on over here? You have this is a pure example of doctrinal developments going on in Roman Catholic Church, and I think we can move on to talk
actually,
about.
I wanted to point something because
sure.
it's perfect segue. At some point, there is claims that we change our position regarding the Immaculate Conception, which is ridiculous because the Immaculate Conception, there's a prerequisite for the Immaculate Conception that is a dogma that was never adopted in the East, which is the Roman understanding of the sin of Adam, the primordial sin. So, there is a claim from Flanders that we actually used to have Immaculate Conception and then we rejected it. And it's actually wrong. And because, of course, we do not have this prerequisite dogma. And what's very interesting is that Immaculate Conception is actually a proof of an innovation that's non-traditional. So at some point it will... Flanders will call us, will link us to Protestants, saying that we are sola scriptura plus church fathers, and at the same time he will say that when we have a problem, we can look into tradition, we can look into the fathers, we can look into the council, when they have to disprove Vatican II. But what's interesting is that the Immaculate Conception is a dogma that could not have been proclaimed before papal infallibility, before you actually had the Pope, which apparently is the instance that is supposed to guarantee the truth, because there is no traditional grounding in the Immaculate Conception, and we can see this when it started to become popular. So it started to become popular.
And as a small aside, I will also add, you mentioned them talking about how we can find our truths in tradition throughout the teachings of the saints, but yet they somehow act like that's not what we do. So basically, they're doing the same thing, but when we do it, it's not fine because we don't have the Pope, even though. How do they find out what's dogma and what's not? It's through tradition, it's through the writings of the saints. That's the same thing we do.
Yeah. So when it comes to the Immaculate Conception, you can look at the doctors, so the tradition of the Roman Church. You have Aquinas saying that the Immaculate Conception is not possible. So he argued against the Immaculate Conception, saying that it would give characteristic of Christ to the Theotokos, to Mary. And you even have Bernard of Clairvaux, who is the first one to document this this new, at the time I think it was monks making a new feast around the Immaculate Conception, and he was documenting it, saying, "Oh, it's great if you make new dogma about Mary, but this is an innovation." So you can see that early on, when it starts to become popular, the Roman tradition already rejected through its doctors. When it starts to gain some steam, is later on, and there's actually a priest that became later a bishop that was part of the side of the Roman Catholic Church, who really wanted to promote the Immaculate Conception. And what did he do? He actually went scouting through church history, and he found some Eastern prayers, some Coptic prayers calling the Theotokos Immaculate, which in the Eastern context is fine, because we believe she's immaculate. We just believe she's not immaculately conceived, because we don't have the same understanding of the sin of Adam. So he brings this as an argument, which is not really an argument, and he admits it himself. And then he even has to dig as far as looking into the Quran and to the Surah Al-Imran, and actually mistranslating the Quran, because there's this Surah Al-Imran where the Quran actually quotes the Protevangelion of St. James, the Proto-Gospel of St. James, and he has to translate Allah purified you into Allah created you pure. So, when your dogma have so little ground in church traditions that you need to falsify a heretic book, the Quran, in order to prove it, it doesn't hold much truth. So this is what Abimalu had to do at the time with a Belgian bishop. And this dogma of Immaculate Conception could not be confirmed through regular means. It actually had to be confirmed through an infallible declaration. So you see that actually in giving power to this to the Pope, in giving power to this new papal institution, especially when it comes to infallibility, you actually allow for someone to stray away from tradition. And I think we can move on to the ecclesiological difference now.
Yeah, so let's do some sort of a summary of all their objections they had against us, because it was kind of all over the place. It was some very basic objections they had. Lewis, you probably have timestamps and all that.
Their main objection was that we have no pragmatic way of having an ecumenical council, and this is one of the big blunders, because so Marshall says that we haven't had a council since 787. Now, this ignores the 8th Ecumenical Synod and the 9th Ecumenical Synod. Whether or not we call them ecumenical is irrelevant. Fact of the matter is that they are received in the church in our liturgy. St. Photius, the 8th Council, recognizes a saint, and St. Gregory Palamas recognizes a saint for the 9th Synod, and Blackernay, whatever you want to say. Mm-hmm. I always think of bechamel when I see that, but yeah, so condemnation of the filioque and stuff, and Flanders kind of just says, "Oh, well, I know Blackernay condemns the filioque, but there's no reason for me to accept it as binding authority." Oh, really? So the tradition of the church is not sufficient authority. The liturgy is not a sufficient authority for you. And it does have canons that anathematize certain views of filioque and establishes the doctrine of the energetic procession. I'm very confused about what he's talking about. It clarifies the Orthodox view, and all the patriarchs agreed to this. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, they want to enforce that we need all our patriarchs to agree on something, and then when they do, all of a sudden, it's not enough. Oh, they presuppose that we need the Pope. We don't need the Pope. Our church is functioning just fine without the Pope. The other point, so they talked about divorce, remarriage, contraception. I think we cover that quite well. They talk about how we're very prideful and whatnot. We've been through that. I think those were kind of the main points. They said that our first millennium saints teach papal supremacy, which is also false. We've responded to those.
And by the way, just to clarify, I think we will agree there is a papal primacy, although it doesn't. To me, it seems like we have a different view of what primacy means, because they think primacy is supremacy. But we will say that, the Pope is the first bishop. I mean,
So the Pope had the primate has a what was known as an appellate jurisdiction, which is that he can receive appeals from churches around the ecumene. And the primate is like the highest. He has a universal appellate jurisdiction, right? So he can receive appeals from all around the church. But if you look at the canons of Sardica, which lay out so these are privileges given to the first see. They're not from divine gift from Christ and Peter and that. So he can reopen cases by retrial, and Constantinople also received this privilege at Chalcedon.
Yep, Canon 28.
Sorry. So,
yeah, you might kind of.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I cut out. Yeah, sorry. So
and
Chalcedon also the Constantinople also received this privilege as well. So yeah.
And what does the Council of Nicaea talk about in terms of Rome? The seat of Rome. It says it's a custom like the other sees.
Right. Yeah.
Like
Canon
Alexandria.
6.
I believe
so
7 or 6. Yeah.
So yeah, this was another critique they made, and they cite Soloviev, is that apparently we're just Eastern national churches. But if you look at the history of the church has always been, the local churches have always been formed along national borders. You may think that's wrong. You could make a case for that. Because these are just customs. We could draw lines of autocephalous churches along different lines if the church decided to, but that's just how it's traditionally been done.
Yeah, and they talk about we should protect the faith of our forefathers, but suddenly nationalized churches. No, that's not fine. It's hypocrisy, double standards all over.
Well, they have nationalized churches, of course.
Exactly.
So they accuse us of having overlapping jurisdictions.
Yeah.
And overlapping jurisdictions are a problem, we will admit. And the thing is that ideally these overlapping jurisdictions would be solved. It's unfortunate, and the thing is that these overlapping jurisdictions mainly exist in sort of diaspora areas where diaspora churches exist, so in the West. But these kind of overlapping jurisdictions don't exist in, say, Russia or Serbia and things like that.
Or like in Antioch or Jerusalem, whereas you have Roman
Catholicism. The Antiochian Uniates have 3 patriarchs of Antioch.
Gee, Billy, 3 patriarchs?
Yeah. And Taylor Marshall got very, very upset. He said, well, the fathers would say if you have more than 2 bishops in one city, that's sacrilegious. Well, you have 3 first hierarchs in one city.
And
of the same church,
Tim even
supposedly
tried to point that out, but he's playing the double, so he doesn't even talk about that. Indeed, he's like, we have the same thing, but it's fine if we do it. It's fine if we do it. It's not fine if Orthodox do it.
Yeah, this is at 1 hour, 11 minutes and 15 seconds.
Yeah, they completely missed out the Uniates. So at many points throughout his argumentation, at least the Uniates refute him. When he talks about all saints, about salvation outside the church, actually in accepting the Uniates, they accept Orthodox saints that were outside of communion with Rome at the time of their death.
Yes, exactly.
With the Uniates, they accept several patriarchs.
Can I add something really small thing? When they talk about multiplicity of rites, the rites aren't just the liturgy itself or how it's done. It's also the calendar, right? Rites contain many other things. And one of the things that the Byzantine rite has is the Byzantine Menaion, which is the calendar of the saints. So they actually inherit or saints in the calendar as well when they have the Byzantine rite. This is the thing that they don't understand. This is like, they don't really understand liturgy. Okay, that's fine. But when you're accepting different rites, you're accepting their saints too. And this is why in the Chaldean Catholic Church, you have Theodore of Mopsuestia, you have Diodore of Tarsus, who are the original Nestorians. They are referred to in that communion as the Greek doctors. So they refer to as Greek doctors. And in the East, now in the West, they have a tradition of calling heretics fathers of the church, like Origen. In the East, we don't have that tradition. In the East, if you're a doctor of the church, you're a saint. And Nestorius, Diodore of Tarsus, Theodore of Mopsuestia, they're all saints in the Roman Catholic Church. So when you have rites, when you have a multiplicity of rites, you're also containing the religious calendar and the saints of those rites too. That's what I wanted to add, basically, because a lot of people don't. They miss out on that.
To expand on this, at 1 hour and 8 minutes, he says that there is a fantasy of union in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but no, we are united. We are united through rites, through sacraments. We receive some Eucharist. Like you're praying, to receive it in mouth instead of hand. You're praying for ad orientem. We are united in this. We have one creed, one united creed. In the West, you already have several. You alternate between the forged creed of Athanasius. You use the creed of the Apostles. And you have the altered version of the Nicene Creed. At the same time, you're in communion with the Uniats, who, for example, use Nestorian creeds for the Chaldeans. They say Christotokos instead of Theotokos, as the mother of Christ, as the mother of God. That's not Protestant. You are united with a variety of different saints. For example, you believe Photios is a heretic, but he's simultaneously a saint in your church through the full communion of the Uniats. And the Uniats are in full communion. This existed way before Vatican II, and this existed, and then they're in full communion. And if you say they are heretic, it means that the primates of the East are cardinals, so your pope is being elected by heretics. Also inside of Rome, inside of the Roman Communion, you say you want a unified authority. You cannot even agree on whether Vatican II is a council, an ecumenical council or not, even though it's pretty clear you yourself are fighting against the idea that Vatican II is a council, or if you actually say that it's an ecumenical council, you are trying to put your own interpretation of it, which goes against the council itself. You can't agree on.
This is a huge issue. I mean, they accuse us of disunity on these things, but their main argument against us is that we can't convene an ecumenical council. But their most recent ecumenical council, they can't even agree on. They have conservative Novus Ordo Catholics who accept Vatican II. They have trad Latin Mass attendees who think Vatican II is basically just a pastoral council. They have sedes, they have the SSPX, they have uniates, and then they have the proper boomer modernists who think Vatican II is the best thing since sliced bread.
Yeah. By the way, if you believe that it is disingenuous of us to say that the Sedevacantists are a flavor of Roman Catholicism, actually at 113, Flanders states that we have many schisms that happen to our church, and we have many different groups that split off from us, which means that we're not the right church. But you have the Sedevacantists, for example, who split off. You have the old Catholics who recognize they were
Anglo-Catholics. Yep.
Yeah, you have the Anglo-Catholics, you have all the Protestants. The Protestants are ultimately the product of Rome, because they happened, after the schism in the Roman jurisdiction. Some Protestants even fought against Roman innovation. For example, look
even
at
in their theology, it's an inheritance to Rome, even in their theologies. For example, the substitutionary atonement theory of Anselm is basically a Protestant theory now. It's a Protestant doctrine, even though it's a Roman Catholic.
And we're not bringing the Protestant stuff up we're doing it because they cited they consider the Oriental Heterodox and the Assyrian Church of the East and the old calendarists and some other schismatics to be our internal disputes, essentially.
Yeah,
and if
actually,
you play that game,
if you look at some proto-Protestant movements, you will see that some of them actually fought against Rome on grounds of tradition. For example, Jan Hus, who was a proto-Protestant and was actually burnt after the Council of Constance. He rebelled against Rome because Rome was actually altering the Eucharist. Rome was saying that no, laity should be deprived of the wine, the blood of Christ. From the Eucharist, which for him was, altering sacramental abuse, and he was actually in that regard fighting against papal innovation. So before trying to compare us to Protestants, you should look at early Protestantism, the fact that it actually fought against some papal innovations, even though it was ultimately wrong and innovated itself. Something I want to add at some point, Marshall and
Before you
Flanders.
do that, actually, this was long overdue. I should have mentioned it beforehand, but I think I'm gonna show it on the stream to recording. So this is from Ivan Nostromov's book on the Council of Florence, and I'm showing you this because this is about Council of Jerusalem after Council of Florence. I'm showing you this because one of the objections that Tim had is that we don't have the ability to convene synods and gather patriarchs around and make a decision. Tim, you have no idea what you're talking about, and you should actually learn about stuff before you run your mouth, because it's not gonna look good when you actually run your mouth off and speak of lies. We had the best example of a refutation against this is the Council of Florence. Months, I'm saying months, not even years. They think that Vatican II being convened in 4 years is a success. We had a Council of Jerusalem that condemned the Council of Florence few months after the Council of Florence was finished, and this council had 3 Eastern Patriarchates. That's right, they had Antioch, they had Jerusalem, they had Alexandria. So they had all the 3 big patriarchs, major patriarchs, coming to the council and condemning the Council of Florence. So you had Constantinople, who had the Union, and the rest of the Pentarchy, which the Pentarchy isn't really a thing, but if you're playing that game, the rest of the Pentarchy in Orthodoxy, they all condemned the Council of Florence. They all gathered together and said, oh, Florence is a false council. And then Constantinople itself, even through emperors and patriarchs, rejected. Saint Gennadius rejected the Council of Florence. But in 1484, they completely anathemized the Council of Florence. So how can you say that we can't gather patriarchs around and make a decision, make anathemas against councils? You're either lying or you have no idea what you're talking about, and you should stop talking about stuff that you have no idea about, because you just make yourself look like a silly person. And there are many other examples that we can talk about of bishops gathering around and anathemizing things. One interesting thing I've heard Timothy say is, if you're going to talk about how bad Immaculate Conception is, why don't you anathemize it first? Oh, so are we going to anathemize literally every single stupid position that every single heretic comes up with? No, we don't need to do that. We don't have an anathema against people that believe, I don't know, like 5 persons in the Godhead or anything like that. So, like, we don't have an anathema of people that believe like, oh, if you believe that Christ is 60% human and 50% divine and 40% duck and 2% bacteria, you're anathema from the true church. We don't need to do that.
Yeah, normally the church, when it does anathemas, are to anathematize individuals that are kind of like within the church per se,
Exactly.
to heresies or controversies within the church that arise, to excise them from the church. It's not about condemning necessarily. It can be sometimes, but most of the time it's about
Like
excising
Calvinists.
heresy from within the church. Yeah, but even in that case, it was because there were Calvinist writings that were reaching the East, and a lot of bishops were kind of getting enamored with it. So the Pan-Orthodox Synod of 1672 had to gather and condemn those Calvinism and all that, which is another example of a Pan-Orthodox Synod that has
Tim will
authority as part
say,
of tradition.
yep, and Tim will say, well, why should I listen to those synods? Well, why should you listen to any synod then in any of your areas before the First Council of Nicaea? I mean, this is such a stupid argument to point out. Like, why should you listen to any single council? The point of a council is to make a declaration. You have to listen to it, unless it's speaking of untruth, which is going to be resolved either way.
Yeah, unless it blatantly contradicts tradition.
Exactly.
I mean, when Leo rejected the Robber Synod, he didn't reject it on the grounds that, like, he didn't just outright reject it from papal authority. He rejected it because he said it had unfair proceedings and because it was against tradition. That's what he said.
Right, because Saint Flavian was beaten and martyred at that council, which you're not supposed to be doing. So here's the thing: if you need a pope to decide if a robber synod is a robber synod because they beat up people, I think you need to get your head checked if you need a pope to actually decide what is a Roman synod or not.
Yeah, and the Pope epistemic thing just kicks the problem back a step, because even in Roman Catholicism, the Pope can't, or at least the trads would say, like Taylor Marshall would say, that the Pope can't convene an ecumenical council or make an ex cathedra statement that contradicts tradition, right? Tradition is always the ultimate authority, and in Taylor Marshall's mind, he can judge what is tradition and what is not. But I'm not entirely sure how that jives with the fact that the Pope is supposed to be the ultimate judge of tradition.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, you have certain Anglican scholars a couple of years ago arguing against Pope Francis, and they will argue against not only Pope Francis but also previous popes because of modernism. And speaking of modernism, this is a little aside. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but they talked about Pope Pius X as being this sort of like a hero of traditionalism. Pope Pius, did you know that Pope Pius X is the one that kickstarted Vatican II? He's the one that introduced liturgical reforms. So he's not your magic trad hero. He's just as big of a scum as the other modernists. But you completely ignore that because he says some cool things at some times. Anyways, in regards to
should we cover KGB bishops and
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But I was gonna mention in regards to how we can in church epistemology, we had Anglican apologists pointing out, well, you have popes that go against certain Roman Catholic canons. So how is it that your current popes are actually actual popes? And he argues that because these popes are going against Roman Catholic canons, they're fake popes in the Roman Catholic worldview. So there's no actual real popes afterwards. And the Roman Catholic apologist answer is, guess what it is? Guess what the answer is? We know a pope is a true pope because the church accepts him to be the true pope. That is textbook reception theory, which is the same thing that we apply in order to understand which council is a true council and which council is a false council. So you still have reception theory in the Roman Catholic Church. You just have an additional step, and that's the papacy. But for us, we just don't have that step. And as you mentioned, with how Taylor Marshall dictates what is Catholic and what is not, exactly, he dictates it by saints, he dictates it by traditions. We do the same thing, but somehow, it's fine if he does it. It's not fine if we do it, and this is the same exact thing. And I want to finalize it by saying, when they're criticizing, when they're talking about the problems they have in their own church, they talk about Vatican II and all that stuff. Ultimately, what they're saying is that, we have problems, but we have structural superiority in that regard. Well, that seems arbitrary because you say that we both have problems, which anyone that's sane will also say that we have less problems. But anyways, they say that we have issues, we have problems, and our problems are structural, but they ignore their problems being structural as well. They don't say that their problems are structural, but ours are structural. So you have a double standard, it's arbitrary. And there's many, amongst many other things that's arbitrary, that's also one of the many things that is arbitrary. And yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to add something. So actually, probably the point where it really shows that they are applying this double standard is around the end of the debate. Dr. Taylor Marshall start to say that, we're not worried at all because the Pope will fix the problems. That's at 1 hour and 7 minutes. Don't worry, the Pope will fix any problem. If there's any problems, we have the ultimate authority to do it. And what's very funny is that at 1 hour 15, you have Flanders actually saying that yes, the papacy is a very, very efficient structure, because in just mere 4 years they managed to wrap up, to convoke and to wrap up the Council of Vatican II, which, according to many trads, actually destroys the church. So congrats, your structure is so efficient that in a mere 4 years you managed to damage your church. And why? Because you have this unity. Because you, by corrupting one guy, you can actually hurt the whole church in a very short amount of time. So when you say that the Pope will fix the problem, yes, the Pope will fix the problems that are caused by the papacy. Which is like your solution is your problem as well, which is ridiculous. You say that everything is already set, but you cannot go against the Pope. So if the Pope declares heresy ex cathedra, what's going to happen? What if he contradicts tradition ex cathedra, which arguably is what happened during the Council of Vatican II, during the dogmatic constitution of Lumen Gentium, for example, said with true magisterial authority during a council.
Where they say isn't that the one where they say Muslims can attain salvation?
It basically leaves a teeny tiny crack. It's a humiliation. It's the Pope humiliating the trads. Is they leave a teeny tiny crack, saying the whole tone of the document suggests that yes, they actually can attain salvation, but they say, oh, they participate in salvation. So they try to say, oh, but they participate in salvation in failing, or they participate in salvation in converting to Catholicism. But like the whole tone of the document literally says that you can have people that are rightfully guided, even if they're idolaters, that the Muslim praise the God of Abraham, the one true God alongside us. But yes, this is in a dogmatic constitution said with magisterial authority in an ecumenical council, according to actually the guy who theorized infallibility, Cardinal Fessler. Infallibility happens as a charisma when all the conditions are met, and the conditions are the Pope declares reveals a new doctrine of faith or morals applicable to the whole Church with magisterial authority. Officially as a true Pope.
And that reminds me of the supposed Saint John Paul II in Ankara, going to Turkey, Ankara, and asking Saint John the Baptist to pray for Islam, like not for Muslims to become Christians, for Islam. And he's a saint in their church. I mean, what a joke.
Yes. So again, how can ultimately this whole thing is a huge hypocrisy. We're going to wrap up soon, but your main argument was you don't have the papacy. How can you do anything? And your whole life's work is actually fighting against the papacy. So you want to hold us to standards that you cannot even follow yourself. And ultimately, you declaring that your structure is better doesn't match.
And their mask also falls off at the end, where they make this some sort of like this Freudian and psychological analysis, where they're basically condescending, like they're talking about us in a condescending manner, saying that we are basically like children in a single parent household, single mother household with no daddy, and we have daddy issues, and Rome is our daddy and all that, and we're just mad for all the stuff that happened in the past. I mean, this is what they think about us. Orthodox Christians, this is for you. This is what they think about us. They think about us as like little children with no daddies. That's what they think about us. They don't think about us as brothers in Christ. They don't think about us as fellow Christians. They think about us as pathetic little children. And I can't imagine how any Orthodox Christian can listen to this and say, oh, that's completely justified. I mean, the mask is off. There's no love towards us. There's complete hatred. And I think this, like, in all the pious sounding language that they have in the stream, that's ultimately the mask going off. It's ultimately them considering us as pathetic little children. And
yeah, which is a stupid analogy, because we believe that, and actually we demonstrated here, that it's actually Rome who schismed, who strayed away from tradition, who today is reaping the rewards of straying away from tradition. And yes, of course, making this psychoanalysis is very traditional. So yeah, ultimately, it's based on false presuppositions that you have yourself about the papacy. Where for us, you are just a branch that went away. Talking about branch that went away, what surprises me still is that after saying all these kind of things, at the very end, at 1:23, in the same breath, Dr. Marshall calls us a withered branch, a withered branch, but says that still we hold grace in our liturgy, because today all the trads are praying for an ad orientem. They are praying to receive, the communion not by hand. And they say, oh, but their liturgy is beautiful, but anyway, it's going to lead you to hell. But there is still grace. There is still grace of the Spirit there. So Dr.
We're
Marshall
a
hasn't
withered branch
held
because we don't have doctrinal development, is what he's really saying.
Yes. Which is weird because the church has never been about pumping out doctrinal development. It's been about conserving the truth, not making it evolve. So yeah, at the end, Dr. Marshall didn't have a single coherent statement, but he closes off by saying that we don't have any grace, but we have grace in our liturgy somehow. One other point, and 1:21 is so still going on about the comparing us to children. Flanders says that we have a theology of negation. So here we can see the real pride showing is that
1 hour 20 minutes and 50 seconds.
We say that we have a theology of negation. Theology of negation because we don't accept papal supremacy. So because we agree with the President on one thing, that the Pope is not infallible, we are just this branch straying away from them, and we are just living in negation. So first of all, it says that I need positive truth. The Orthodox Church believes in positive truth, and it says that you cannot have any discipline or any dogma negatively. You should read the anathema. The anathema of every council is actually showing, is actually defining our faith negatively by showing what we should not do. In Matthew 2, Christ himself says, look, this is how the Pharisees pray. You should not do like this, because you should not do like these guys. In the Didache, the teaching of the apostles says that, look, you shouldn't follow the same fast as the Jews, because they're heretical. So actually, once again, several times.
We shouldn't fast like the Jews do because they're hypocrites.
Yeah.
That's the reason why the fasting is Wednesday and Friday.
Yeah. So once again, you have Dr. Flanders proving that he doesn't have a clue about the history of the early church, saying that you need positive truth. We provide positive truth, but the fact that we are defined negatively, we define some things negatively, doesn't negate the whole church. Otherwise, it should negate the entire early church. And it's very prideful to say, I'm going to proclaim a dogma, and people who don't agree with it are just prideful. Aren't we technically, living as Christian monotheists in negation of polytheism? Aren't we, as Trinitarian, whole negating, the Quranic understanding of God? This is again, very, very low level analysis, trying to do some very trad psychoanalysis. Which doesn't hold much ground.
Can we do one final bit on KGB bishops?
Yeah.
Because that's something that you hear so often. Do you guys want to say anything? Because the one thing I'd say is that, we have had some bishops who were KGB, okay, but what KGB doctrines did they promulgate exactly? I'm a little confused, because I'm not seeing how our church has been in any way doctrinally affected by some bishops who were in these kinds of positions. And I think that sometimes, I'm not like a commie apologist or anything, God forbid, but I think sometimes whenever we imagine someone who's KGB, we think they're some kind of like agent with a Kalashnikov that like guns you down, but really, these could just be individuals working in offices. I think they were a lot of the time. So yeah, that's part of my take.
And trying to say that our bishops are illegitimate, and they kind of implied that. I'm not going to pretend as if they didn't. Trying to argue that our bishops are illegitimate because they're KGB bishops is Donatism. You're a Donatist. Bravo. Because you're basically saying that the grace comes from the person, not from the office that the person holds. And That's literally the sin of Donatism. They were talking about how the failure of Donatism is basically saying, "Oh, you're sinful. You're illegitimate clergy." That's basically the same thing of what you're doing, right? This doesn't mean doesn't mean, oh, KGB bishops are based and they're fine. Obviously not. Obviously it's a problem, but it's not something. It's not a church ender. You know what's a church ender? Anything Francis does is a church ender, I will say. Anything that's happening with Vatican II, with anything, will pretty much be a church ender. Anything regarding
Infallibly so.
Less priests coming in to Roman Catholic Church, vocations dying, that's a church ender. These are church ending things. And so, and I'm not using these arguments because, oh, you have bad things. No, it's because your whole stream is orthodoxy has bad things. And what we're trying to provide you here is that by using your same standard, actually, you're way worse than we are. And it's silly to even argue about these things, I will say. And so I think that will kind of be like a finalizing point, is this whole stream is just absolute hypocritical nonsense, rife with double standards, ignorance of church history, and I hope they're not bad-willed. I hope they're not bad-willed, because if they are bad-willed, well, it's gonna be very bad for them. But if they're just simply ignorant, that can still be fixed. But ultimately, this stream just shows these people. I mean, Taylor Marshall, a PhD, has no idea about Orthodox theology, no idea about Orthodox history, no idea about Orthodox theology, no idea about how our ecclesiology works. And Tim, I mean, he says that he has been Orthodox, but the blunders he's making, and he hasn't even been following the Orthodox world yet. He still thinks that he's the person that can talk about what has been happening in the Orthodox world. And you have all of these people that has no idea about Orthodox Church, hearing these things and being deceived by these people. And you have to just say, I mean, we just have to, we were forced to make this video because of this, because we can't just let people just listen to this nonsense and be indoctrinated by falsehood. We have to speak up against it.
Yeah, I would just add one thing about the KGB agent. Maybe we can place it in post. First of all, I'm surprised to see that the KGB is still operating in 2020. And second of all, like as Louis said, where is the KGB doctrine in the Orthodox Church right now? Where is it? If you look at the history of the Soviet Union and when it started to work out, as actually were accords between the papacy and the Soviet Union to help, through Uniatism to root out to an extent the local churches. And let's look, at the doctrine of KGB, namely communism. Today, whose priests are teaching communism? Today, the most dominant form of philosophical, political, religious thought in South America, for example, is liberation theology, which is textbook socialism, which is taken directly from the social doctrine of the church, which actually were inspiring for communism. So today, whose church is really KGB? Your KGB, your lavender KGB, which is even worse. And we can see it coming back to the highest instances. For example, if you look at the Pachamama Synod, yes, I know you can dig your head in the dirt saying that, oh, it never happened because you don't find the final document in English. The final document has been released in Spanish long ago. It's textbook liberation theology through and through.
Ecological sins and that sort of stuff. But if you're not going to listen to that, the Pope is not wrong, but I'm not prideful. But the Pope is just wrong. I'm just not prideful. But my pride is gone because I believe in the papacy. I mean, think of these things. Think of what you're saying. And do you have anything to add?
No, I think Flanders is really careful about saying that, this so-called pride that we have will lead us to hell. He's having, this whole stream is having, is displaying the same pride that he apparently
I think we basically talked about how we feel about the stream for more than 2 hours. If you don't have anything to add, then we can just kind of end it here. And anything to add, Lewis? Anything to add, Snek, about the?
No, I would just say that at the end of the day, if you look at the Decalogue, this is a clear case of false witness, of bringing, false accusation.
Yep.
In a context where the other person is not even a defendant, so inquiring in our salvation in regards to or links with the papacy is really weird when you are
and neither of them are willing to allow Orthodox to defend themselves. I think that says a lot.
I mean, I think the only real arguments that came up in this were the actual respectable arguments were the attempts to show the papacy in the first millennium with Pope Victor.
And even then, that's weak.
Maybe divorce and remarriage, because I understand some of the stuff around that is quite maybe perhaps a bit obscure. Some of the quotes could be a bit obscure. And also the contraception stuff is quite complicated.
But even in terms of contraception, the grass is greener on the other side, 100%, and that grass being ours.
Right. Right. I mean, and the other thing would maybe the pragmatic and epistemic criticism is also kind of something that should be addressed. But everything else, the KGB bishops, the overlapping jurisdictions, the Saint Isaac the Syrian, these things about having to do the missionary work, the numbers arguments, Caesaropapism, all these things really,
which by the way, Saint Isaac
beneath anyone with a PhD, beneath anyone with a exactly. Yeah.
True Uniatism.
It's beneath anyone calling us a theology of negation, calling us Protestants. I mean, this is really just below anyone. Beneath anyone that
even a high schooler won't do this, let alone a university graduate. 100%. I mean, anyways, I think we covered our feelings about this stream. Thank you all for watching. Hopefully we managed to give you a good insight about what's wrong with their objections about Eastern Orthodoxy. And hopefully we clarified certain things about the Orthodox Church and Orthodox theology, Orthodox history. I know we haven't really talked much about theology because they didn't talk about theology, but, maybe in the future. Hopefully they don't do any streams about Orthodoxy and embarrass themselves even more. Thank you all for watching.
I don't want to watch another stream.
Me neither. I'm going to completely ignore it. So thank you all for watching. God bless you all.
I mean,
I'll
it's
see you guys
bad, but ultimately they are... ultimately they are...
You ruined my outro. You ruined my outro.
Right, I'm shutting up.
See you guys in the next video. God bless you all.